At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law ripped the scarf covering my head and screamed, "Stop faking cancer! You shaved your head just to keep the inheritance." Everyone laughed at my bald head while I cried, until a mysterious man shouted, "Silence!" He covered my head with his coat and said 4 words that no one could have foreseen. "I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment what city you're watching from. That way I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought the day of my husband's funeral would be the most humiliating day of my entire life. My name is Sandra. I am 65 years old, and up until that moment, I believed I had hit rock bottom when the doctors told me I had cancer. I was wrong. There are pains that go far beyond any physical illness. The funeral home smelled of wilted flowers and disinfectant. The casket was surrounded by wreaths I hadn't asked for, but which arrived from people who barely knew him. My husband, Arthur, a 70-year-old man, healthy as an ox, until that Tuesday afternoon when he simply collapsed, had died of a massive heart attack while pruning the roses in his garden. I was sitting in the front row with my navy blue scarf covering my bald head. The chemotherapy treatment had begun 6 months before Arthur's heart attack. He accompanied me to every session, held my hand when I vomited until I couldn't anymore, and bought me 5 different scarves so I could choose according to my mood. The navy blue one was my favorite because it was the color of his eyes. Ashley, my 8-year-old daughter-in-law, arrived late as always. She wore a black dress that was far too tight and heels that echoed against the marble floor like hammer blows. Her husband, Charlie, my stepson, walked behind her with his head down. Ever since Arthur married me 15 years ago, Ashley never accepted me. To her, I was the intruder who had forced her way into their perfect family. During the ceremony, I noticed how Ashley looked at me with pure disdain. Every time someone came up to offer their condolences, she pursed her lips. When Arthur's sister hugged me and said that he had been so lucky to have me by his side during his illness, I saw Ashley clench her fists. The moment of greatest tension arrived when the pastor asked if someone from the family wanted to say a few words. I had prepared a short speech about the love Arthur and I shared during these 15 years. But before I could even stand up, Ashley got to her feet. "I will speak for the family," she announced with a firm voice. She marched to the podium with determined steps. Her face held an expression I couldn't quite interpret at the time, but which I now recognize as pure, calculated malice. "My father-in-law Arthur was a wonderful man," she began, "but in his final years he had to carry many unnecessary burdens." My stomach dropped. I knew she was referring to me, to my illness, to the medical bills. Arthur never complained, never made me feel like a burden, but Ashley always insinuated that I was ruining the last years of his life. "There are people who take advantage of the kindness of others," she continued. "People who fake illnesses to get attention and money." The room filled with uncomfortable murmurs. Some people looked at me in confusion. I felt as if I had been punched in the gut. I couldn't believe she was implying that at her own father-in-law's funeral. But the worst was yet to come. Ashley stepped down from the podium and walked straight toward me. Her eyes gleamed with a cruelty that made my blood run cold. She stopped in front of my chair and, without warning, reached her hand out toward my head. "Enough of this charade!" she screamed as she yanked my navy blue scarf. The fabric slipped off my head, exposing my completely bald skull. I felt the cold air against my bare skin and the stares of everyone present piercing right through me. The silence that followed was deafening. "Look, everyone!" Ashley exclaimed, waving my scarf in the air like a trophy. "This woman shaved her head to pretend she has cancer, all just to keep Arthur's inheritance." The laughter started as a low murmur, but quickly turned into open guffaws. Some of the people who had come purely out of social obligation were laughing without trying to hide it. I heard someone whisper, "I always thought it was suspicious that she got sick right when Arthur started talking about changing his will." I tried to cover my head with my hands, but it was useless. Tears began to stream down my cheeks as the echo of their laughter rang in my ears. Ashley smiled triumphantly, as if she had just won a battle she had been fighting for years. "She's a fraud," she yelled again. Arthur was too good-natured to realize it, but we aren't stupid. I closed my eyes, wishing the earth would just swallow me whole. I wanted to scream at them that it was real, that I had the medical records, that I had spent entirely sleepless nights vomiting until I passed out, that I had lost 20 pounds in 3 months. But the words wouldn't come out of my throat, which was completely choked with humiliation. In that moment of absolute despair, when I thought I couldn't endure even a single second more of that public torture, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. Silence. The entire room went instantly mute. The laughter stopped so abruptly that the contrast was deeply unsettling. I looked up and saw an older man, about 70 years old, walking toward us with firm, unwavering steps. He wore a long, dark gray overcoat, and his presence radiated an authority that made even Ashley take a step back. The man reached me and, without saying a word, took off his coat and gently placed it over my head, covering me with a tenderness that completely contrasted with the harshness of his voice when he had yelled. Everyone was watching him expectantly, especially Ashley, whose face had lost every trace of triumph and now showed something that looked a lot like fear. The man looked her dead in the eye, and with a voice that reached the very last corner of the room, he pronounced 4 words that no one in that room would ever forget. "She is dying." Those were the 4 words the man spoke, and it was as if he had detonated a bomb right in the middle of the room. The silence that followed was so thick I could feel it pressing against my ears. Ashley stood paralyzed, my scarf still gripped in her trembling hands. But before I explain who this man was and why his words had such an impact, I need to tell you how we got to that moment. Because Ashley's cruelty hadn't just started that day, it had been a slow torture that lasted for years. 3 years ago, during Christmas of 2020, Ashley arrived at our house with a gift wrapped in shiny gold paper. Arthur was thrilled. He had always dreamed of having a close relationship with his daughter-in-law. When I opened the box, I found a curly blonde wig, completely different from my natural brown hair. "I thought you might want to change up your look," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "At your age, hair gets so dull." Arthur laughed, thinking it was just a friendly joke. I forced a smile and thanked her for the gift. But that night, I cried in the bathroom. It wasn't the first time Ashley had made remarks about my appearance, my age, or my place in the family. When Arthur and I got married, I was 50 and he was 55. We had been neighbors for 2 years after both of us had been widowed. Charlie, Arthur's son, was 25 at the time and seemed perfectly fine with our relationship. It was when he married Ashley, 2 years later, that everything changed. Ashley was 30 when she entered our lives, beautiful, ambitious, and with a special talent for making hurtful comments disguised as concern. "Sandra, honey, don't you think that blouse is a bit too young for you? Arthur, you shouldn't be carrying those heavy bags at your age. It's bad for your heart. What a shame you two didn't have kids together. Charlie will be the only one taking care of the family." For years, I tried to win her affection. I cooked her favorite meals when she came to visit. I bought her expensive gifts for her birthdays, and I even took care of her when she had pneumonia last year. But nothing worked. If anything, my kindness only seemed to irritate her more. The breaking point came a year ago when Arthur started talking about updating his will. It wasn't a secret. He wanted to make sure I would be financially protected if anything happened to him. The house was in both of our names, but he had savings and investments that he wanted to organize better. Ashley became much more hostile after that. She started making passive-aggressive comments about young women who marry older men for money right in front of Arthur, who always defended her by saying she was just joking. But I could see the coldness in her eyes. When I was diagnosed with cancer 8 months ago, I thought maybe the situation would improve. I expected a little bit of compassion, or at least for her to put aside her hostility during my treatment. But it was the exact opposite. The first time Ashley saw my shaved head after my second chemotherapy session, she made a comment that broke my heart. "So dramatic, Sandra. My cousin had cancer last year, and she never completely shaved her head. Isn't that a bit of an exaggeration?" Arthur scolded her that time, but the damage was already done. Ashley had planted a seed of doubt, and I could see it germinating in the minds of some people in our social circle. During my treatments, Arthur was my rock. He drove me to the hospital, stayed with me through hours of chemotherapy, and made me chicken broth when I couldn't keep any other food down. But Ashley always found ways to minimize his support. "Poor Arthur," she would say to Charlie when they thought I couldn't hear them. "He's spending all his life savings on treatments. I just hope it's worth it." 2 months before Arthur's death, we had a terrible argument. I had caught Ashley snooping through the papers in our desk while Arthur was out in the garden. "What are you doing?" I asked her. She looked at me without a single ounce of shame. "I just wanted to see how much you guys are spending on your little situation. Charlie and I are concerned about the family finances." "That is none of your business," I replied, trying my hardest to stay calm. Ashley stood up straight, and for the very first time, completely dropped her mask of fake concern. "Of course it's my business. Charlie is Arthur's only real child, not you, who just showed up when he was already old and vulnerable." "Arthur loves me," I said, feeling my voice crack. "Arthur pities you," she fired back coldly. "There's a difference. And when he realizes how much money you've blown on your made-up illness, he's going to see things very differently." That conversation haunted me for weeks. I started to doubt myself, wondering if I truly was a burden to Arthur. I stopped telling him when I felt sick after my treatments. I tried to hide my pain so he wouldn't worry. The week before Arthur died, he found me crying in the bathroom after a particularly grueling chemo session. "My love, what's wrong?" he asked, kneeling down right beside me. "Ashley says I'm spending all your savings," I whispered. "She says you just feel sorry for me." Arthur took my face in his hands and looked at me with an intensity I will never forget. "Sandra Mary Hughes," he said, using my full name like he always did when he wanted my absolute attention. "You are the love of my life. I don't care if I have to spend every last penny I have to make you well. I don't care if Ashley or anyone else doesn't understand it. You are my wife, and I love you." It was the last serious conversation we ever had. 3 days later, while watering his favorite roses, his heart simply stopped. Now, back at the funeral, the mysterious man was still standing in front of us after having spoken those 4 devastating words. Ashley had let go of my scarf, which dropped to the floor like a flag of surrender. "Who are you?" Charlie asked, his voice shaking. The man didn't take his eyes off Ashley. "I am someone who knows the truth," he answered, with a voice that chilled the blood. Ashley took another step back, and I could see the color completely drain from her face. For the first time since I had met her, Ashley actually looked scared. The man finally looked at me, and his eyes softened. "Mrs. Hughes, your husband asked me to come today. There are things you need to know." He then turned to the crowd. "My name is Dr. Marcus Davis," the man stated, his voice echoing throughout the room. "I am an oncologist at St. Michael's General Hospital, and for the past 8 months, I have been the attending physician for Mrs. Sandra Hughes." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Ashley flinched backward as if she had been struck by an invisible slap. Her face, which only moments ago radiated malicious triumph, now showed a sickly pallor. "Arthur Hughes contacted me 3 weeks ago, Dr. Davis continued, his gaze locked onto Ashley. He was deeply concerned about the cruel comments he had been hearing regarding his wife's actual medical condition. He explicitly asked me to be here today, at his funeral, just in case it became necessary to defend the dignity of the woman he loved until his very last breath. I was still sitting there in total shock, with the doctor's overcoat draped over my head. I couldn't believe Arthur had done that. Even after death, he was still protecting me. Dr. Davis pulled a folder out of his black leather briefcase. "Mrs. Ashley Miller," he said, addressing my daughter-in-law directly. "You have just publicly accused a severely ill woman of faking cancer to extort money. Allow me to educate you on the medical reality of Mrs. Hughes." Ashley tried to speak, but the words wouldn't leave her throat. Charlie stepped closer to her, confused and clearly embarrassed. "Sandra Mary Hughes," the doctor read from his paperwork. 65 years of age, diagnosed on March 15th of last year with stage 3 pancreatic adenocarcinoma. It is one of the most aggressive forms of cancer in existence. The silence in the hall was absolute. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. "The chemotherapy she has been receiving," the doctor continued, "includes a combination of gemcitabine and cisplatin. These medications cost approximately $3,200 per session. Mrs. Hughes has completed 24 sessions to date. I did the math in my head. $76,800. An absolute fortune that Arthur had paid without a single complaint. The side effects of this treatment, Dr. Davis went on, his voice growing harsher by the second, include complete hair loss, severe nausea, constant vomiting, extreme weight loss, debilitating fatigue, and pain that can only be described as excruciating. Ashley finally found her voice. But she looks fine. She's not as sick as she says. Dr. Davis glared at her with a look that could have melted steel. Mrs. Miller, are you a doctor? Do you have any formal training in oncology, or do you just enjoy torturing women who are fighting for their lives? Charlie grabbed his wife's arm. Ashley, stop, he muttered, but she yanked herself free. There has to be a mistake, Ashley insisted, though her voice now sounded desperate. She doesn't act like someone who is dying, the doctor finished for her. Those words dropped over the room like heavy stones. I felt as if all the air had been sucked right out of my lungs. Dr. Davis flipped to another section of the folder. Mrs. Hughes not only has cancer, but her prognosis is extremely grim. Despite our absolute best efforts, the disease has begun to metastasize. Tears started rolling down my cheeks all over again, but this time not out of humiliation, but from the crushing weight of hearing my own death sentence spoken out loud. According to our latest scans done just last week, the doctor continued in a much softer tone, now addressing the entire congregation. We give her between 4 and 6 months to live. A muffled gasp escaped from Helen's throat as she covered her mouth with her hands. Several people started crying openly. The stark contrast to the cruel laughter from just minutes ago was absolutely devastating. Her husband, Arthur, Dr. Davis pressed on, knew all about the prognosis. He spent the final weeks of his life not only caring for her physical needs, but relentlessly researching experimental treatments, consulting with specialists in other states, and draining his life savings to give her the absolute best fighting chance that existed. Ashley stumbled backward, reaching out for the back of a chair to support herself. Her face had turned a sickly shade of green. While all of you, the doctor said, glaring at Ashley and then at the people who had laughed at me, were mocking a woman who is fighting the hardest battle of her life, her dying husband was using his very last ounces of energy to make sure she wouldn't have to face this war alone. He held up another piece of paper. I have a letter here that Arthur wrote, to be read today in the event that anyone dared to question the validity of his wife's illness. With trembling hands, he unfolded the letter. Arthur's handwriting, which I knew so well, was clearly visible, even from my seat. To whom it may concern, the doctor read, my name is Arthur Hughes, and if you are hearing this letter, it means that I have passed away, and someone has dared to question my wife Sandra's illness. I want you all to know that over these last few months, I have been a witness to a kind of courage I didn't even know existed. I have seen my wife get up every single morning despite unbearable pain, smile at me despite constant nausea, and hold me with a strength she shouldn't even have left. All just so my final days wouldn't be filled with sadness. My crying grew heavier. I recognized those words, that unconditional love that Arthur had shown me every single day. Sandra isn't faking anything, the doctor continued reading. She is dying, and she is doing so with a grace and dignity that completely breaks my heart. If anyone dares to question her, especially my daughter-in-law Ashley, I want you to know that that person knows absolutely nothing about true love, about real sacrifice, or about what it actually means to stand by someone's side when it truly matters. Ashley collapsed into a chair, finally grasping the sheer magnitude of what she had just done. Charlie looked at her with a mix of utter horror and deep shame that I had never seen on his face before. Sandra deserves respect, love, and care in her final months, the doctor finished reading. She does not deserve to be attacked by small-minded people who fail to comprehend that money means absolutely nothing compared to the privilege of loving someone extraordinary until the very end. Dr. Davis carefully folded the letter and put it away. He then turned directly to me. Mrs. Hughes, your husband asked me to tell you one more thing. He asked me to tell you that he knew you were strong, far stronger than even you yourself believed, and that he trusts you will use whatever time you have left to live with the exact same dignity you have always shown. I pulled the coat off my head and slowly stood up. My bald skull gleamed under the lights of the hall, but I no longer felt an ounce of shame. I felt powerful. Thank you, doctor. I said, with a voice that sounded steadier than I had felt in months. Ashley was still sitting down, staring at the floor, her whole body shaking. The silence that lingered was different from the previous one. It wasn't the silence of shock or expectation. It was the heavy silence of collective remorse. But there was something else in Dr. Davis's eyes, a look that told me this revelation was not over yet. Dr. Davis closed his medical file and pulled another envelope from his briefcase. This one was thicker, sealed with red wax, and had my name written in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. Mrs. Hughes, he said solemnly. Your husband entrusted this to me with very specific instructions. I was supposed to give it to you today after the funeral, but given the circumstances, he cast a disdainful glance at Ashley. I believe it's entirely appropriate to do it right now. I took the envelope with trembling hands. The wax seal was completely intact, meaning no one else had opened it. In the top right corner, Arthur had written, "For my beloved Sandra, for when you need it most." "Open it," the doctor encouraged me softly. I broke the seal and pulled out several folded documents. The top one was a personal letter, but underneath it were official papers that I instantly recognized as legal documents. I began to read the letter out loud, feeling as if Arthur were lending me his strength from wherever he was. My dearest Sandra, if you are reading this, it means I have died, and someone has questioned your rightful place in our family. I want you to know that over these last few months, while I was taking care of you and watching you fight cancer with superhuman bravery, I made a few very important decisions. Ashley's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. 3 months ago, I went to the office of my attorney, Robert Sterling, and I drafted a new will. A will that completely overrides the previous one, the one that Ashley saw when she went snooping through my papers without permission. Charlie went pale. Ashley, what did you do? I was just, Ashley stammered, but she couldn't even finish her sentence. I kept reading. In this new will, I stipulate the following. The house where we have lived so happily these past 15 years is entirely yours, Sandra. No matter what happens, no one can ever take it from you. The $400,000 from my retirement savings is also yours, as well as my bank investments, which total approximately $250,000 more. Ashley shot up from her chair so fast she almost fell over. That can't be legal. Charlie is his son. He has a right to his inheritance. Charlie will receive something, I continued reading, but only if he treats Sandra with the utmost respect she deserves. If he or his wife try to harm you in any way, they will lose absolutely everything. Dr. Davis gave a faint smile. Your husband was a very smart man, Mrs. Hughes. Ashley whirled around to face Charlie, looking completely frantic. You have to do something. That woman is stealing your inheritance. Sue the estate. But Charlie was just staring at his wife with an expression I had never seen him wear. It was a mix of profound shame and something much darker. Total disappointment. Ashley, Charlie said, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. You just publicly humiliated a woman who is dying. You just mocked someone who has been nothing but kind to you for 13 straight years. But she's keeping all our money, Ashley protested. It's not our money. I finally exploded, surprising even myself with the sheer force of my voice. It is my husband's money, and he decided to leave it to me. I stood tall, still gripping the letter. The entire room was watching me, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel small under their gaze. For 13 years, I said, speaking not just to Ashley, but to every single person in that room, I have endured your hurtful comments. I have put up with your constant insinuations that I am a gold digger. I have smiled through it when you humiliated me. I cooked for you when you were sick. I bought you birthday presents with money I earned working as a secretary for 40 years. Ashley opened her mouth to argue, but Charlie placed a firm hand on her arm to stop her. I have taken care of this family, I went on. I have loved your husband like the son I never had. I have been there for every single birthday, every Christmas, every important milestone. And when I got sick with cancer, when I actually needed support, you decided to turn my suffering into a prime opportunity to hurt me even more. Tears were streaming freely down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of utter liberation. Arthur saw all of that, I said, looking over at my husband's casket. He saw how you treated me. He saw how you tried to make me doubt his love. He saw how you turned my final months with him into an absolute nightmare of insecurity and pain. I looked back down at the letter. There is something else, Sandra. Over the last few weeks, I hired a private investigator to document the conversations Ashley had when she thought no one was listening. A collective chill ran through the room. Ashley went completely white. The investigator recorded conversations where Ashley told her friends she was just waiting for me to die so they could finally be rid of the old faker and keep what was rightfully hers. He also recorded a conversation where she was planning to convince Charlie to put me in a nursing home the second I was gone. Charlie whipped his head toward his wife, his eyes wide with absolute horror. Ashley, tell me that isn't true. Ashley backed away, desperately searching for the right words. I was just upset. I didn't mean it. I also have recordings, I kept reading, where Ashley tells her sister that she's going to do everything in her power to make your life a living hell until you leave the house voluntarily, just so Charlie can sell it and give her the money. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the people who had been laughing at me just minutes prior were now looking at Ashley with sheer, unadulterated disgust. Charlie stepped entirely away from his wife. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashley tried to reach out to him, but Charlie held up a hand to stop her. Tell me the truth, Ashley. Were you planning to throw Sandra into a nursing home? The pause hung in the air for far too long. When Ashley finally spoke, her voice was just a faint squeak. I just thought that it would be better for her to be around professionals who understood her condition. It was a plan to get rid of me, I screamed, feeling years of pent-up rage finally bursting out. You wanted the house. You wanted the money. And I was just an obstacle in your way. Charlie buried his face in his hands. When he finally lowered them, his eyes were brimming with tears. Ashley, he said, his voice completely broken, what have you turned into? But Ashley had no answer. Or maybe the real answer was that she had always been exactly like this, and we had all just been far too blind to see it. Dr. Davis walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Hughes, there is one last thing inside the envelope. I reached inside and pulled out a smaller slip of paper. It was a handwritten note. Sandra, do not let anyone steal whatever happiness you have left. Live these final months like the queen you have always been. I love you forever, Arthur. But what I didn't know then was that this massive revelation was just the very beginning of a transformation that would change not only my life, but my death as well. 3 weeks after the funeral, my entire life had completely flipped upside down. I was no longer the humiliated woman who had been publicly attacked by her daughter-in-law. I was now Sandra Hughes, a dignified widow with more than enough resources to live out her final months exactly as she pleased. The first major decision I made was to hire attorney Robert Sterling, the very same man who had helped Arthur draft his new will. Robert was 62, had perfectly styled silver hair, and maintained an absolutely flawless reputation across town. When I walked into his office that Wednesday morning, he already had every single document we would need fully prepared. Mrs. Hughes, he said warmly as he poured me a fresh cup of coffee, your husband told me all about your family dynamic. He wanted to make absolutely certain that you had all the legal backing necessary to protect your interests. I laid out exactly what I wanted to do. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, but it wasn't blind forgiveness either. It was carefully calculated justice. First of all, I told him, I want to set up a trust fund for Charlie. He will inherit $200,000, but only upon turning 40, and strictly on the condition that he finalizes a divorce from Ashley prior to that date. Robert raised a single eyebrow. That is a highly specific condition. Charlie is a good man who married the entirely wrong woman, I explained. Arthur loved him deeply, and so do I, but I absolutely refuse to let Ashley benefit from a single red cent of my husband's generosity. And if he chooses not to divorce her, then every penny of that money will be donated directly to the Cancer Research Foundation at St. Michael's Hospital. Robert offered a slight, knowing smile. Your husband did tell me you were much sharper than people gave you credit for. The second decision was regarding the house. The property was valued at approximately $450,000, and I knew I wouldn't live long enough to fully enjoy it, but I also didn't want Ashley to ever set foot in it again. I want to stipulate that if Charlie wants to inherit the house after I pass away, I told Robert, he can have it. but only if he comes to visit me at least once a week during my final months without Ashley. Robert took careful notes. And if he fails to do so, the house gets sold and all the proceeds go straight to charity. It was a test, but an entirely fair one. I wanted to see if Charlie actually cared about me as a human being, or if I was merely a roadblock to his inheritance. The following months were incredibly revealing. Charlie actually started visiting me on Sunday afternoons. At first, the conversations were agonizingly stiff, filled with clumsy apologies and long, awkward silences. But gradually, we truly started getting to know each other for the very first time. I always knew Ashley was difficult. He confessed to me during one of his visits in November, but I never fully realized just how vicious she could be toward you. We were sitting in the living room, sipping the exact same chamomile tea that Arthur used to brew for me after my grueling chemo sessions. I had lost even more weight, and my energy was visibly draining week by week, but my mind had never been sharper. Your father tried to warn you about her from the very beginning, I gently reminded him, but you seemed so blindingly in love that we didn't want to interfere. Charlie dragged his hands down his face with a heavy sigh. She convinced me that you were just jealous, that you didn't actually want me to be happy. For years, I truly believed that you were the core problem. And what do you think now? He stared out the window, looking out toward the very garden where Arthur had taken his final breath. Now, I think I married a total stranger. The woman who publicly humiliated a dying person at a funeral. That is not the woman I fell in love with. Through those long conversations, I discovered that Charlie had been suffering in his own way, too. Ashley had been heavily controlling him financially. She dictated what clothes he wore, who he was allowed to talk to, and even what he ate. Slowly but surely, she had isolated Charlie from almost all of his friends and family, leaving only the people she explicitly approved of. She's trying to get me to move to Florida, he confided in me in December. She claims there are just too many negative memories here. Negative memories of what? Of your father? Of me? Of your actual family? That conversation absolutely shattered my heart. Ashley hadn't just been trying to erase me from Charlie's life. She was actively trying to erase the very memory of his father. During my final months, I also received a few highly unexpected visitors. Arthur's sister, Helen, started coming over twice a week. She brought me homemade soups and would sit on the couch watching daytime soap operas with me. Several of Arthur's friends from the local gardening club also began stopping by, looking deeply ashamed for having laughed at me during the funeral. We just didn't know, Mary, the wife of Arthur's best friend, told me repeatedly. We foolishly believed what Ashley was implying, that you were drastically exaggerating your illness. People tend to believe what's easiest to believe, I replied. I don't hold it against you. But the most shockingly unexpected visit was from Ashley herself. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in January, right when my health had taken a very noticeable nosedive. Charlie had warned me that she might try to drop by, but I had genuinely assumed she wouldn't have the nerve. She looked awful. She had lost weight, had deep dark circles under her eyes, and her usually flawless hair was a total mess. When I opened the front door, she just stood there for several long seconds without uttering a word. What do you want, Ashley? I asked, cutting straight to the chase. I just want to talk to you. I stepped aside to let her in, but I certainly didn't offer her coffee or water. She sat rigidly on the absolute edge of the sofa, wringing her hands nervously. Sandra, I just wanted to tell you that you're sorry. I finished the sentence for her. That it was a huge mistake, that you were just under a lot of stress. Ashley nodded eagerly. Yes, exactly. I was just dealing with so much stress from everything, and my head wasn't in the right place. I let out a laugh. But there wasn't a single shred of humor in it. Ashley, you knew exactly what you were doing. That wasn't stress. That was pure, calculated malice. Her face instantly hardened, flashing glimpses of the vicious woman she had unleashed at the funeral. Look, I didn't come over here just to let you attack me. I came to make peace. Make peace for what? So that Charlie can finally inherit the house? Ashley's face flushed bright red, instantly confirming my suspicions. Charlie already told me all about your little plans to drag him down to Florida, I continued. You want to pull him as far away from here as possible, right? Away from the memories of his father? away from any real connection to his actual family? That's completely untrue, she weakly protested. Ashley, I said, mustering every single ounce of strength I had left in my body, I want you to listen to me very, very carefully. Charlie can absolutely have the house when I pass away, but only if he legally divorces you first. He can have the $200,000, but only if he cuts you entirely out of his life. Her pathetic mask of fake humility shattered into a million pieces. You can't do that. You can't force him to choose. I am not forcing him to do anything. I am simply giving him an option. A life with you, or a life with actual dignity and resources. Ashley shot up from the couch. Charlie will never leave me. He loves me. Maybe, I said with total calm, but if he genuinely loves you more than the memory of his own father and the promise of a much better life, well, then maybe the two of you truly deserve to end up together in poverty. Ashley stormed right out of my house, slamming the front door as hard as she could. It was the absolute last time I ever laid eyes on her. 2 weeks later, Charlie showed up for his usual Sunday visit, wearing a smile I hadn't seen on his face in years. I asked her for a divorce, he told me. Plain and simple. I didn't pry. I didn't ask why or how it went down. I just poured him a fresh cup of tea and asked him how he was feeling. Free, he replied. For the very first time in years, I finally feel free. During my final days, as my physical body grew weaker and weaker, but my spirit grew unimaginably stronger, I realized that Arthur had given me the single most valuable gift of all. It wasn't just the financial security. It was the rare opportunity to spend my final months on Earth being genuinely respected and deeply loved by the people who truly mattered. I passed away on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 8 months after the funeral where Ashley had tried to destroy me. But this time, my death was entirely different. This time, I died surrounded by deep love, profound respect, and the absolute satisfaction of knowing that I had lived my final months exactly like the Queen Arthur always insisted I was. Charlie was right by my side, gently holding my hand. Helen, Arthur's sister, was sitting in the other chair, softly reading aloud from the book of poetry Arthur had gifted me on our very first anniversary. Dr. Davis had stopped by to see me the night before, warmly assuring me that the very end would be completely peaceful. "Do not be afraid," he had said softly. "Your husband would be so incredibly proud of the immense strength you have shown." In my final few weeks, something truly extraordinary had taken place. Completely defying the medical predictions, I hadn't passed away within the 4 to 6 months they had originally estimated. I had lived 8 full months following the terminal prognosis. Dr. Davis simply chalked it up to the sheer power of human willpower, but I knew it was something much deeper. It was a burning determination to see pure justice served. During those extra months, I had meticulously reorganized every single detail of my estate, not out of spiteful revenge, but out of a deep, abiding love for the people who had genuinely cared for me. The reading of my will took place exactly 1 week after my funeral. Robert Sterling had arranged the official gathering at his downtown office. The people summoned were Charlie, Helen, Dr. Davis, Mary, the wife of Arthur's best friend, and, quite shockingly, Ashley. Charlie had been entirely caught off guard to learn that Ashley had even been included. "Why on earth did you invite her?" he had asked. "Your stepmother had her specific reasons," Robert had replied with a hint of mystery. The morning of the reading, everyone awkwardly gathered in Robert's sleek, elegant conference room. Charlie looked far healthier and more vibrant than he had in years. The divorce had been officially finalized 2 whole months prior to my passing, and he had wisely used that time to reconnect with old friends and rediscover the man he actually was. Helen arrived dressed in black, but wore a warm, peaceful smile on her face. She had wholly inherited Arthur's deep love for gardening and had been diligently tending to the beautiful roses he had planted in my backyard. Dr. Davis arrived carrying his usual leather briefcase, but this time it held no medical files, only something far more personal. Mary walked in, looking anxious, totally unsure why she had even been included in the will of a woman she had mostly known through her husband. And finally, Ashley walked in. She looked drastically different since the divorce, much thinner, incredibly pale, and with a bitter hardness in her eyes that had never been there before. She had moved into a tiny apartment on the far less glamorous side of town and was now working as a front desk receptionist at a local dental clinic. Life without Charlie's financial cushion had been a very brutal wake-up call. Robert efficiently went through the standard legal formalities, but very quickly arrived at the exact part everyone had come to hear. Mrs. Sandra Hughes left extremely specific instructions regarding exactly how she wished her assets to be distributed, he announced to the room. But she also left deeply personal letters for every single one of you, which she explicitly mandated must be read out loud prior to any formal distribution. He handed the very first letter directly to Charlie. With shaking hands, Charlie opened the envelope and began to read aloud. My dearest Charlie, over these last few months, you have truly proven yourself to be the exact man your father always knew you could be. You consciously chose dignity over sheer convenience, absolute truth over comfortable lies, and genuine, real love over toxic manipulation. For that exact reason, I am leaving you the house where your father was so incredibly happy, along with $200,000, so you can properly start a brand new life. But far more importantly than all of that, I leave you with the absolute certainty that your father and I always loved you deeply, even in the moments when we simply couldn't show it. Use this money wisely, marry for genuine love the next time around, and continue to be the deeply honorable man I now know you are. Charlie furiously wiped the streaming tears from his eyes. $200,000 was far more than he had ever expected, especially considering he had already met the strict requirements by finalizing the divorce. The second letter was addressed to Helen. Dearest Helen, you were the sister I never had, and the fiercely loyal friend who tightly held my hand when I needed it the absolute most. I am leaving you $50,000 and every single piece of the antique furniture in the house that you always admired so much. But far more than that, I leave you my eternal, deepest gratitude for loving me like real, true family. Helen wept openly in her chair, not for the money, but for the deeply sincere words of love. The third letter was for Dr. Davis. Dr. Marcus Davis, you were my absolute fiercely protective shield in the darkest, most terrifying moment of my entire life. Your bold intervention at the funeral didn't just defend my dignity, it wholly restored my will to live my final months exactly like a queen. I am leaving you $5,000 to be donated straight to the hospital for advanced cancer research, and in addition to that, I leave you this. Robert handed the doctor a neatly wrapped package. When he opened it, he found the exact same navy blue scarf that Ashley had violently ripped from my head at the funeral. But now, it was beautifully framed, complete with a small engraved brass plaque that read, "For the great man who covered my head when everyone else mocked my pain." Dr. Davis sat completely speechless, tightly clutching the wooden frame against his chest. The fourth letter was for Mary. Mary, I know deep down you feel incredibly guilty for laughing at me at the funeral. I want you to know right now that I forgive you entirely. Good people make foolish mistakes when they are fed toxic, incorrect information. Your deep, sincere remorse and all the lovely afternoons you spent with me watching our soap operas meant far more to me than you could ever possibly imagine. I am leaving you $15,000, not because you need to buy my forgiveness, but simply because you already have it. Mary completely broke down, sobbing, burying her face into her hands. Finally, Robert slowly turned his attention toward Ashley. Every single person in the room immediately tensed up, silently wondering what on earth I could have possibly left to the woman who had publicly humiliated me. Ashley Miller, Robert stated with cold formality. Mrs. Hughes has also left something specifically for you. He handed her a much thinner envelope than the rest. Ashley slowly reached out and took it with violently trembling hands. Inside was just a single sheet of paper, along with a very small, flat object. Ashley began to read silently to herself at first, but Robert firmly instructed her to read it out loud for the room. With a weak, barely audible voice, Ashley began. Ashley, I am not leaving you any money, simply because all the money in the world cannot buy the one thing you actually need, a heart that knows how to truly love. For 13 long years, I had the distinct opportunity to truly know you, and what I saw left me deeply, profoundly saddened. Not for myself, but for you. You have spent so much of your life fueled by pure hatred and endless manipulation that you have completely forgotten how to be genuinely happy. Ashley paused, her breathing growing incredibly shallow and ragged. Yet, she pushed through and continued reading. However, I am leaving you something far more valuable than a check. I am leaving you a lesson. The exact way you treat people in their absolute most vulnerable moments is the single truest measure of who you actually are. I sincerely hope that someday, when you are lying on your own deathbed, you have people standing right next to you who truly, genuinely love you, not for what they can extract from you, but for who you actually are as a person. But in order to ever have that, you first have to do the hard work of becoming someone actually worthy of being loved. Tears were streaming freely down Ashley's pale face, but she forced herself to finish. I am also leaving you this, so you can clearly remember the exact day you violently ripped away a dying woman's dignity in front of her entire community, and exactly what that single action says about your character. Ashley reached in and pulled the small object out of the envelope. It was a high-resolution photograph of the exact moment at the funeral when she had violently yanked my scarf off, capturing my expression of sheer, absolute agony perfectly. This photograph, Ashley read aloud, her voice completely cracking, is to constantly remind you that choices have very real consequences, and that karma isn't just petty revenge, it's simply life perfectly reflecting right back at you exactly what you put out into it. I genuinely hope you become a much better person, not for my sake, but to save your own soul. Ashley finally finished reading and completely collapsed into her leather chair, sobbing utterly uncontrollably. Robert waited silently for her to compose herself before making the final grand announcement: the entire remainder of Mrs. Hughes's assets, totaling approximately $150,000, is to be entirely allocated to establish the Arthur and Sandra Hughes Foundation, dedicated to providing direct financial and emotional support to terminal cancer patients who currently lack sufficient family support. But there was one final surprise left. Robert pulled one last sealed envelope from his mahogany desk. Mrs. Hughes explicitly requested that I read this final statement aloud only after all of you had finished hearing your individual letters. He broke the seal and began reading in his smooth, professional tone. If you are all hearing this, it means I have officially passed away, and I deeply hope it was with the exact grace and dignity that my beloved Arthur always wanted for me. I want all of you to fully understand that the last 8 months of my life were the absolute most powerful months I have ever experienced. Not simply because I was dying, but because I had finally learned how to truly live completely free from the crippling fear of other people's judgment. For years, I allowed Ashley to constantly make me feel tiny and utterly unworthy. But, Doctor, I Alameda Video, by Edify. Davis's bold intervention at my funeral taught me a massive, fundamental truth. When you finally know who you truly are, the cruel, bitter opinions of others lose absolutely all of their power over you. I lived 4 full months longer than the top doctors predicted, and I firmly believe it was simply because I still had vital work to finish. I needed to make absolutely sure that Charlie found his way back to being the honorable man his father raised him to be. I needed to make sure that the genuinely good people in my life clearly knew exactly how much I deeply loved them. And yes, I absolutely needed to ensure that Ashley finally understood the brutal, real-world consequences of pure cruelty. But above all else, I truly needed to prove to myself that a 5-year-old woman battling terminal cancer could still be immensely powerful, could still be incredibly wise, and could still absolutely dictate exactly how her own final chapter would end. I died like a queen, exactly as Arthur always told me I was, and that is the absolute greatest victory of all. The silence that washed over the room was entirely different from any silence I had ever caused before. It wasn't the heavy silence of public humiliation or the sudden silence of pure shock. It was the profound, lingering silence of absolute, deepest respect. Charlie was the very first person to break it. She won, he said, simply and plainly. In the end, she absolutely won, and he was completely right. I had won. not by viciously destroying my enemies, but by living with such fierce, unwavering dignity that even my final, fading months transformed into a shining testament of pure strength. Ashley silently stood up from her chair and walked straight toward the heavy wooden door. Right before she stepped out, she turned back one final time. She was right, she whispered into the quiet room, about absolutely everything. And with that, she pulled the heavy door shut behind her. According to what Robert told me later, Ashley packed up and moved entirely out of state just a few short weeks after the reading of the will. Charlie proudly used his inheritance to launch a small, thriving landscaping business to deeply honor his father, and faithfully donated a generous portion of his profits every single year to the foundation I established. But the absolute most important thing of all was that I was never again remembered as the poor, pathetic woman who was publicly humiliated at a funeral. Instead, I was widely remembered as the fierce woman who brilliantly transformed her deep pain into immense power, her public humiliation into towering dignity, and her own death into a profound, unforgettable life lesson for every single person who witnessed it. In the very end, Arthur was completely right. I truly was a queen. It just took nearly dying for me to finally believe it. Yeah.